Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is the video you should watch before you read Chapter 4. Chapter 4, not a lot of great stories in Chapter 4 from a humanistic point of view anyway, but it's important that we read it. So it's called The Plan of Empire, but the bottom line is the Brits never really had a plan for empire. So these colonies started to develop with a lot of independence. They weren't heavily policed by the British in the 1600s. So that's sort of the gist of what's going on in the colonies as far as the British are concerned. And I think as a historian, this streak for independence, which is going to really come to play out in the late 1700s, about 100 years past where we're at right now, really begins with this loose control that the British have over the colonies in the 1600s. And they would try to take control again in the early 1700s, or at least tighten things up. But I think that this streak for independence really begins in the mid 1600s. Now that can be argued, but as you go through the chapter, some of the highlights of the chapter is that the British take control of New Amsterdam from the Dutch. So now New York is being formed. Pennsylvania is being formed by William Penn and the Quakers. And so you're going to start to read about these colonies coming together. The other significant part of this chapter is really about slavery and the beginnings of the cruelty of slavery as we know it, and slavery being codified as something that's related to the color of one's skin. So you're going to read a little bit about Barbados and the sugar plantations in Barbados, which are British. And the reason Barbados and the sugar plantations are important is because of the slave codes that begin there. In other words, this idea that the slaves are, the Africans are not even human, and they're treated very cruelly. And so you're going to read about that Caribbean connection. And the reason it's important is that cultural treatment of slaves in Barbados gets transferred directly into the Carolinas and into Virginia as the South becomes dependent upon slavery. So this idea that slaves are the other, or Africans are the other based on the color of their skin, really begins there. And if you think of history, if you think of the past and the present, and you see racism in the present time, then a lot of that goes all the way back to the 1600s. And I think it's important as we think about society and culture that the way people are treated, whether it's the color of their skin, the religion, their sexual orientation, can really change things for centuries to come. So pay attention to that. There's no easy way to reconcile slavery. There's no easy way to reconcile the treatment of the Native Americans, but I think it's important history nevertheless. So as we go through the text really quick here, you'll read about Barbados, you're going to read about France, and you're going to read about England, and how, as the empires have conflicts over in Europe, especially France and England, how that affects things here in North America. Generally, the Native Americans almost always pay the price. They're always in the middle of these battles of empire. There was a great book written some time ago by Richard White called The Middle Ground, and it really talks about how the Native Americans kind of get trapped between these empires of France and England. So you'll read through about the conflict of empire. You're also going to read briefly about what's going on in England, something called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. That's where Parliament wrestles power away from the king, and how that changes the way the colonies are treated here. So again, when you look at sort of this macro sense of history, you see that things that are happening in the colonies are a result of what's going on in the empires. What's going on in London, what's going on in Paris has a great effect on the colonies, and eventually also has a great effect on the Native Americans. So as I'm going through this chapter, some of the other themes, we talked about slavery. We start to see the formation of Pennsylvania, the transformation of Virginia, which really talks about Virginia becoming a slave state. And also there's the talk about something called Bacon's Rebellion, which is a rebellion between, well, Nathaniel Bacon is actually an elite, but he leads this rebellion against the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And really what they want is they want people to be able to take more land independently, which the Indians will pay the price for that too. The Native Americans will pay the price for that too. But I think it's important because when we think about themes of uprisings and populism, Bacon's Rebellion is something important to read about because it starts to show us how the nature of our society, I would argue even today, this independence streak, this move towards populism, really starts early on, and Bacon's Rebellion is a good, albeit extreme, example of that. So the other things in the chapter, a little bit about the Puritans and prosperity and how as people get wealthier, they tend to get more independent, which always scares the religious leaders because they're losing control. So there's a little bit about that in the chapter. And also there's an interesting read about witchcraft on page 108. That's interesting to me, but really from a philosophical point of view that, witchcraft is all about magic and the occult, and when people can't explain what's going on with scientific terms, often they turn to magic to describe phenomenon. So read about witchcraft. It's a good story. And even though there were male witches, most of this is related to women. So I think it really talks about how gender roles become threatened and how it's sort of easy to pick on women at that time. And as you read about witchcraft and the Salem witchcraft trials, it's interesting that most everybody who's actually executed are women. So there's that part. It talks about France and England and the struggles between those empires, as I've already mentioned. And that's about all you need to know about this chapter. It is going to talk about the Spanish in the southwest United States, and it's important to start thinking about that. As you know, the Spanish really take over Mexico and start to move north. So there's Spanish domination for in areas like where New Mexico is today, up to Taos, Albuquerque, and those areas. And there's still a lot of there's Spanish history out there that you can go see, and a lot of Native American history as well. So that's it for chapter 4. The gist of this is really these struggles for empire and how it plays out here in the colonies. So I hope you have a great week. I'll see you soon. Be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.